On the morning of August 15, 1893, the Newport Police Department received a frantic telegram that would spark one of the Gilded Age's most disturbing unsolved mysteries. 23-year-old Evangeline Cunningham, heir to a railroad fortune worth over $40 million, had vanished without a trace from her family's oceanfront mansion during the most exclusive social event of the Newport season. What made her disappearance truly chilling wasn't just the circumstances, it was what investigators found hidden in her private chambers. Detailed photographs of 13 prominent Newport families, each marked with cryptic symbols, a leather-bound journal containing names, dates, and dollar amounts that would implicate some of America's most powerful industrialists in a web of blackmail and murder that stretched back decades. And most disturbing of all, a collection of forged death certificates bearing the signatures of 3 errant coroners, each documenting deaths that had officially been ruled accidental but showed identical symptoms of arsenic poisoning. For over a century, the Cunningham family has used their influence to keep these discoveries buried, claiming Evangeline died in a tragic accident abroad. Federal investigators who attempted to examine the evidence mysteriously found their access blocked by court orders signed by judges who had financial ties to the same railroad interests Evangeline had been investigating. Local newspaper editors who initially showed interest in the story suddenly reversed course after receiving visits from well-dressed men who spoke quietly about unfortunate consequences for those who spread malicious rumors about respected citizens. But recently discovered court documents and witness testimonies paint a far more sinister picture of that August night in 1893. A cache of letters found in the walls of a demolished mansion in Providence reveals that Evangeline had been working with a network of private investigators, foreign journalists, and even federal agents who were secretly documenting what they termed the American Conspiracy, a systematic campaign of murder and corruption that reached into the highest levels of government and business. Before we continue with the story of Evangeline Cunningham and the dark secrets that may have cost her life, make sure to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. We love hearing from our community of mystery lovers who help us uncover these buried truths. Tonight, we'll reveal evidence that suggests Evangeline's disappearance was not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of eliminations that claimed the lives of at least 37 people who threatened to expose what contemporary documents referred to as the Newport Compact, a secret alliance of America's wealthiest families who had divided the nation's resources among themselves and were prepared to kill anyone who challenged their control. Newport in the summer of 1893 was the undisputed crown jewel of American high society, but beneath its glittering surface lay a web of secrets, rivalries, and barely contained violence that would have shocked the American public had they known the truth. The coastal Rhode Island town had transformed from a modest colonial settlement into what newspapers called America's Monte Carlo, a playground where railroad barons, steel magnates, and shipping dynasties competed to outdo one another in displays of unprecedented wealth. The famous Bellevue Avenue had become a procession of marble palaces masquerading as summer cottages, each more extravagant than the last, their construction having cost the lives of dozens of immigrant workers whose deaths were rarely recorded or investigated. The transformation of Newport into this gilded paradise had been carefully orchestrated by a small group of families who recognized that concentrated wealth required not just business acumen, but also sophisticated methods of social control. They had learned from the labor unrest and political challenges of the 1870s and 1880s that public opinion could be dangerous to their interests. Newport represented their solution, a closed community where they could plan their business strategies, arrange marriages between their children, and coordinate their responses to threats without fear of outside interference. The Cunningham family occupied a position of particular prominence in this rarefied world. Harrison Cunningham had built his empire through the Baltimore and Newport Railroad, a network that connected the major industrial centers of the Northeast and had become essential to the movement of coal, steel, and manufactured goods. By 1893, his wealth was estimated at over $40 million, equivalent to more than $1 billion in today's money. But this figure represented only his acknowledged assets. Private banking records that would not be discovered until the 1970s revealed that Cunningham controlled shadow companies worth at least another $20 million, including mining operations in Colorado, timber companies in the Pacific Northwest, and shipping firms that operated under foreign flags to avoid American labor laws. The family's Newport estate, Windward Hall, sat majestically on a 12-acre bluff overlooking the Atlantic, its 68 rooms filled with treasures collected from across Europe. But the mansion also contained features that few guests ever saw. A private telegraph office connected directly to railroad dispatch centers, a document vault with walls thick enough to withstand dynamite, and a network of underground tunnels that connected to similar facilities at neighboring estates. These features reflected the reality that Newport's social season was as much about coordinating business conspiracies as it was about entertainment. But it was Harrison's daughter, Evangeline, who truly captivated Newport society while simultaneously representing its greatest internal threat. Described by contemporaries as possessing an ethereal beauty that seemed almost otherworldly, she had returned from 3 years of European finishing schools with an education that far exceeded what was considered proper for young women of her station. She spoke 4 languages fluently, had studied philosophy and literature at the Sorbonne, and possessed what her governess diplomatically termed an uncomfortably inquisitive mind. More troublingly for her family's interests, she had also received instruction in accounting, business law, and investigative techniques from professors who had no idea they were educating someone who would use these skills to threaten the entire structure of American corporate power. At 23, Evangeline had already rejected marriage proposals from 2 European counts and the son of a Pennsylvania steel magnate, much to her parents' growing frustration. But her rejections were not based on romantic preference. They stemmed from her discovery that each of these suitors had been selected specifically because their families were complicit in the same network of corruption that her father's business empire depended upon. Through careful investigation, she had learned that the European counts were representatives of banking interests that laundered profits from American industrial accidents, while the steel magnate's son was personally responsible for the deaths of over 40 workers in a series of preventable mine collapses. The summer of 1893 had been particularly tense for the Cunningham family, and indeed for all of Newport's elite families. Harrison's health was failing, though few realized that his symptoms matched those of other business leaders who had begun to question the methods of the Newport Compact. Questions about the railroad succession had begun to surface among business partners and competitors alike, particularly because several recent accidents had eliminated potential challenges to Cunningham's control of key transportation routes. Evangeline, as the only heir, would inherit everything, but only if she married before her 25th birthday, according to the terms of her grandfather's will. This legal stipulation had created a sense of urgency that pervaded every social gathering that season, but it had also provided Evangeline with a powerful bargaining position. She had quietly let it be known among her parents' business associates that her cooperation with the marriage requirement might depend upon receiving satisfactory answers to certain questions about the family business operations. The broader context of 1893 added another layer of complexity to Newport's already intricate social dynamics. The nation was gripping with the panic of 1893, a severe economic depression that had begun that spring when the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad Company failed, triggering a cascade of bank failures and business bankruptcies. While the wealthy residents of Newport appeared largely insulated from the financial crisis, many fortunes were quietly crumbling, and several prominent families had been forced to sell their mansions or retreat to smaller quarters, though they maintained their public facades of prosperity. What the general public did not know was that the Panic of 1893 had been deliberately engineered by the Newport Compact as a method of consolidating their control over American industry. By manipulating credit markets and triggering strategic bankruptcies, they had been able to acquire competitors' assets at fraction of their true value, while their own wealth remained protected through foreign bank accounts and shell companies. In this atmosphere of artificial crisis and hidden desperation, Evangeline Cunningham's massive inheritance had taken on an almost mythical quality among Newport's social circles. The psychological atmosphere of Newport in 1893 was further complicated by the presence of numerous European visitors who had come not merely for social reasons, but as representatives of banking and industrial interests that were seeking to establish footholds in the American economy. Many of these visitors were surprised by the level of violence and intimidation that they discovered among America's business elite. Count Friedrich von Stauffen, a German banker who attended several Newport social events that summer, wrote in his private diary, "The Americans speak of business competition, but what I observe here is more akin to medieval warfare conducted with modern weapons. These people have organized themselves into feudal domains, each protecting its territory through methods that would shock even the most ruthless European industrialists." The Count's observations were particularly astute because he had witnessed several incidents that other guests either missed or chose to ignore. During a garden party at the Pemberton estate, he had observed Theodore Pemberton in heated discussion with a man who appeared to be a federal government official. The conversation ended with Pemberton handing the official a leather briefcase, after which the official departed immediately without participating in the social festivities. When von Stauffen discreetly inquired about the incident, he was told that such exchanges were routine business matters that need not concern social guests. The evening of August 14th, 1893, began like countless others in Newport's social calendar, but contemporary accounts suggest that many of the participants were aware they were attending what might be the final act of a drama that had been building for months. The Cunninghams were hosting their annual Summer's End Ball, a tradition that had become one of the most coveted invitations of the season, but also a gathering that served multiple purposes beyond social entertainment. Over 300 guests had been invited to Windward Hall, representing not only the cream of American and European society, but also a carefully selected group of politicians, judges, journalists, and business leaders whose cooperation was essential to maintaining the Newport Compact's control over American commerce. The mansion blazed with electric lights, still a novelty in 1893 and a display of technological sophistication that few private residences could match. The electric system had been installed not merely for illumination, but also to power a private telephone exchange that allowed the Cunningham family to maintain instant communication with railroad dispatch centers, stock exchanges, and telegraph offices across the nation. Chinese lanterns illuminated the terraced gardens that cascaded down toward the ocean, but hidden among the decorative lighting were calcium lights that could instantly illuminate the entire estate grounds if security concerns arose. The guest list for that evening revealed the true nature of Newport's social structure. Among the attendees were Senator Marcus Hale of Pennsylvania, who had consistently voted against railroad safety legislation; Judge Cornelius Weatherby of the Rhode Island Supreme Court, who had dismissed numerous lawsuits against industrial companies; and Dr. Edmund Sheffield, the state medical examiner whose death certificates had allowed dozens of industrial accidents to be classified as acts of God rather than corporate negligence. Also present were 3 foreign diplomats whose governments had been quietly negotiating trade agreements that would give American corporations preferential access to overseas markets in exchange for substantial private payments to European officials. Evangeline appeared that evening in a gown of pale blue silk, wearing the famous Cunningham sapphires, a necklace worth more than most people would earn in several lifetimes, but also containing a hidden compartment that held several of her most damaging pieces of evidence against the Newport Compact. Those who spoke with her later recalled that she seemed unusually animated, almost excited, though several guests noted an underlying tension in her manner that suggested she was preparing for some decisive action. Mrs. Eleanor Sedgwick, wife of a Boston banking magnate who had herself been investigating irregularities in railroad financing, would later tell investigators that Evangeline had pulled her aside during the first waltz, whispering urgently, "Eleanor, if something should happen to me tonight, remember that you saw me speaking with Theodore Pemberton near the conservatory. Remember the time. It was precisely 9:15, but more importantly, remember that I gave you this." At that moment, Evangeline had slipped a small key into Mrs. Sedgwick's gloved hand, adding, "Post Office Box 247 in Providence. The combination is my birthday reversed. Whatever you find there, ensure it reaches the Boston Herald and the New York World simultaneously." Theodore Pemberton was a 34-year-old heir to a Pittsburgh steel fortune and one of Evangeline's most persistent suitors, but his interest in marriage was motivated by business concerns rather than romantic attraction. Known for his volatile temper and gambling debts that exceeded $200,000, Pemberton had been pressuring the Cunningham family for months to allow him to court Evangeline formally. What few people realized was that Pemberton's debts were owned by the Newport Compact itself, having been purchased from his original creditors as a method of ensuring his cooperation with the organization's activities. That evening, witnesses observed several heated conversations between Pemberton and Harrison Cunningham, though the content of these discussions remained private. However, James Weatherby, the judge's son and a junior partner in the Cunningham Railroad business, was positioned where he could overhear portions of these exchanges. According to his later testimony, Harrison Cunningham was attempting to convince Pemberton that more direct methods might be necessary to resolve the Evangeline situation, while Pemberton expressed concern about the foreign complications that such methods might create. The foreign complications referred to Evangeline's extensive correspondence with European journalists and investigators who had been documenting the international scope of American corporate corruption. Through her European education contacts, she had established relationships with reporters from the London Times, the Paris Le Figaro, and the Berlin Tageblatt, all of whom were preparing exposés about American business practices that violated international law. The Newport Compact had already paid substantial bribes to suppress some of these stories, but Evangeline's cooperation was essential to preventing a coordinated international campaign that could result in trade sanctions and diplomatic consequences. As the evening progressed, Evangeline moved through the crowd with an almost manic energy, engaging in unusually long conversations with various guests, many of whom later reported feeling that she was somehow testing their knowledge or loyalties. Professor Marcus Aldrich of Yale University, who was present as the guest of a prominent Newport family, later recalled being surprised when Evangeline approached him with detailed questions about recent archaeological discoveries in Egypt. She seemed particularly interested in methods of preserving documents and artifacts for extended periods, he would later tell authorities. She asked specifically about waterproof containers and whether organic materials could survive being buried in coastal soil conditions for decades or even centuries. Dr. Sheffield, the medical examiner, found himself engaged in what he initially assumed was casual conversation about forensic medicine, but which he later realized had been a sophisticated interrogation about methods of detecting various poisons and drugs in decomposed remains. Evangeline had demonstrated knowledge about forensic techniques that far exceeded what any society lady should possess, asking specific questions about how long different substances remained detectable in human tissue and whether certain toxins could be confused with natural diseases. At approximately 10:30 p.m., during the height of the evening's festivities, Evangeline excused herself from the ballroom, claiming she needed to retrieve a family heirloom from her private chambers to show to Count von Stauffen, who had expressed interest in American railroad history. This was not unusual behavior. The Cunninghams were known for their impromptu displays of their art collection and historical documents. However, what was unusual was that Evangeline specifically requested that no servants accompany her, insisting she could manage alone, and wanted to select the items personally. What guests did not know was that Evangeline's request to show historical documents to Count von Stauffen was actually a coded signal that she had arranged weeks earlier. The Count was not merely a casual visitor, but a representative of European banking interests who had been investigating American railroad financing irregularities at the request of several German investors who suspected they were being defrauded. Evangeline had been secretly providing him with information about the Newport Compact's international operations, and her mention of retrieving documents was his cue to prepare for the final transfer of evidence that would expose the conspiracy to European authorities. The last confirmed sighting of Evangeline Cunningham was by James Weatherby, who encountered her on the mansion's grand staircase at 10:45 p.m. According to Weatherby's detailed testimony, Evangeline was descending the stairs rapidly, carrying what appeared to be a small leather case or portfolio, but also a larger canvas bag that seemed to contain bulky items. When he offered to escort her back to the ballroom, she declined, saying, "There are some truths that are more important than social propriety, James. Some secrets that can no longer be kept. Your father will understand soon enough what I mean." Weatherby later recalled that Evangeline's manner was not fearful, but rather determined and almost exhilarated, as if she was finally taking action on something she had been planning for a long time. She had also made a cryptic comment about insurance policies that have already been activated, adding that certain letters were posted this afternoon that will ensure the truth survives regardless of what happens to me tonight. When Evangeline failed to return to the ballroom after an hour, her mother, Constance Cunningham, sent servants to check her chambers. They found her room empty, with clear signs of hasty packing. A window overlooking the ocean was open, and several valuable items were missing, including a significant amount of jewelry and cash. Most mysteriously, Evangeline's private safe had been opened. Not forced, but opened with the correct combination, and whatever documents it had contained were gone. However, the servants also discovered evidence that suggested the room had been searched by multiple people after Evangeline's departure. Furniture had been moved slightly, hidden compartments had been located and examined, and even the floorboards showed signs of having been pried up and then carefully replaced. This suggested that whatever Evangeline had taken from her safe, other parties had been aware of its existence and had conducted their own search for additional materials she might have left behind. The immediate response to Evangeline's disappearance revealed the complex web of relationships and rivalries that defined Newport's Gilded Age society, but it also demonstrated the sophisticated methods that America's wealthiest families had developed for controlling information and managing potential scandals. Harrison Cunningham's first instinct was to control the narrative, immediately hiring private investigators from the Pinkerton Detective Agency rather than relying solely on local law enforcement. This decision would later prove crucial, as it allowed the family to suppress evidence that might have led to a swifter resolution of the case, but it also revealed the extent to which local authorities had already been compromised by corporate influence. The Pinkerton agents, led by Detective Captain William Harrington, began their investigation by examining Evangeline's personal effects and interviewing the mansion staff. What they discovered painted a picture of a young woman who had been leading a far more complex and dangerous life than anyone had suspected. Hidden compartments in her writing desk revealed correspondence with lawyers, bankers, federal investigators, and what appeared to be private detectives from as far away as Chicago, San Francisco, and even London and Paris. The letters discussed irregularities in railroad contracts, falsified safety inspections, systematic bribery of federal officials, and most disturbing of all, coordinated elimination of inconvenient witnesses. Captain Harrington, who had 20 years of experience investigating corporate crimes, later wrote in his private notes that Evangeline's documentary collection was the most comprehensive evidence of systematic corruption he had ever encountered. Her files contained not just accusations and suspicions, but actual copies of forged documents, photographs of secret meetings, and what appeared to be detailed financial records showing the flow of bribe money through various shell companies and foreign bank accounts. More disturbing were the detailed notes Evangeline had been keeping about the personal lives and business activities of Newport's most prominent families. Her private journals, written in a cipher that took the Pinkerton agents 3 weeks to decode with the help of cryptography experts from the Treasury Department, contained damaging information about extramarital affairs, business frauds, political corruption, and what appeared to be an organized conspiracy among several railroad companies to fix prices, eliminate competition, and suppress safety. Investigations. One entry, dated just 2 days before her disappearance, read, "The Pemberton contracts are fraudulent. I now have documentary proof that the steel used in the Baltimore Bridge construction was deliberately substituted with substandard materials to increase profit margins. TP personally approved the substitution, knowing that structural failure was virtually inevitable. The original engineering specifications called for Grade A steel throughout, but the delivered materials were Grade C with falsified certificates. The engineering consultant who discovered the substitution, Robert Henley, died in a hotel fire 3 days after submitting his report. His replacement, Dr. Marcus Webb, was paid $50,000 to certify the substandard materials as acceptable. The Baltimore Bridge referenced in Evangeline's notes had collapsed 6 months earlier during the morning rush hour, killing 17 workers and injuring dozens more. The official investigation had concluded that the disaster was caused by an unexpected ice storm that had placed unanticipated stress on the structure, but Evangeline's document suggested a far more sinister explanation. If her allegations were true, Theodore Pemberton and potentially other members of Newport society were guilty of premeditated murder disguised as corporate negligence. As Captain Harrington's investigation progressed, he began to uncover a pattern of suspicious accidents and mysterious deaths connected to the various business enterprises controlled by Newport's elite families. In the past 5 years alone, at least 18 individuals who had been involved in investigating railroad safety violations, steel quality issues, financial irregularities, or labor organizing had died under circumstances that, while officially ruled accidental, showed troubling similarities when examined collectively. The most disturbing case involved David Cavendish, a federal railway inspector who had been investigating safety violations on the Baltimore and Newport line just 18 months before Evangeline's disappearance. Cavendish had been found dead in his hotel room in Baltimore, apparently having suffered a heart attack. However, his widow had insisted that her husband was in perfect health and had recently passed a comprehensive medical examination required for his federal employment. More significantly, she revealed that her husband had been receiving threatening letters for weeks before his death and had recently purchased a substantial life insurance policy after confiding to her that he had discovered evidence of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government and business. And Cavendish had attempted to provide her husband's investigation files to federal authorities, but the documents had mysteriously disappeared from their home during the funeral, apparently taken by individuals who had gained entry without breaking any locks or windows. When she contacted the Cunningham family directly, seeking answers about her husband's death and requesting access to railroad safety records that might support his investigation, she received a visit from 2 well-dressed men who identified themselves as representatives of interests concerned with preventing the spread of malicious rumors. The visitors had not explicitly threatened Mrs. Cavendish, but they had made it clear that her husband's investigation had been based on misunderstandings and incomplete information that could result in unfortunate legal consequences if she continued to make accusations against respected business leaders. They had also pointed out that her husband's federal pension would be jeopardized if his final investigation were deemed to have been conducted improperly, and that her own employment as a school teacher might be affected if local authorities received reports about her unstable mental state following her husband's death. Shortly after this visit, Mrs. Cavendish received a substantial anonymous payment that arrived with a note suggesting she would be wise to abandon her inquiries and relocate to a different city where she could start fresh without the burden of painful memories. She had complied, moving to Oregon and never speaking publicly about her husband's death again, but not before secretly providing copies of his remaining investigation notes to a journalist friend who had promised to continue the investigation. That journalist, Michael O'Connor of the Baltimore Sun, had begun his own investigation into railroad safety violations, but his efforts had been systematically obstructed by officials who claimed that relevant documents had been misfiled or destroyed in routine housekeeping. When O'Connor attempted to interview other federal inspectors, he discovered that several had been transferred to remote locations, while others had been promoted to positions where they no longer had access to operational safety data. O'Connor's investigation had also revealed that the pattern of inspector deaths extended beyond the Cavendish case. In the past 3 years, 7 federal inspectors working on railroad safety issues had died in circumstances that, while individually plausible, formed a statistically impossible pattern when considered together. 3 had suffered heart attacks despite having no prior cardiac problems. 2 had died in hotel fires that destroyed their investigation files. 1 had drowned under circumstances that suggested he had been drugged before entering the water, and 1 had been killed in what appeared to be a random robbery that occurred just days before he was scheduled to testify before a congressional committee. About safety violations. The most chilling discovery in Evangeline's files was a document that appeared to be a price list for various services provided by what was termed the Newport Adjustment Bureau. The document, written in code but with a key that Evangeline had apparently broken, listed fees for permanent solutions to persistent problems, accidental resolution of inconvenient situations, and comprehensive reputation management services. The prices ranged from $5,000 for simple intimidation to $50,000 for permanent elimination with complete documentary cleanup. Captain Harrington's investigation of this document led him to discover that the Newport Adjustment Bureau was apparently a real organization, operating out of offices in New York, Chicago, and San Francisco, that provided what it advertised as discreet consulting services for industrial concerns. However, when Harrington attempted to investigate the organization directly, he found that its offices were closed, its staff had disappeared, and its business records had been removed from all official repositories. 3 weeks after Evangeline's disappearance, Captain Harrington made a discovery that would fundamentally alter the direction of the investigation and reveal the true scope of the conspiracy that Evangeline had been documenting. While examining the grounds of Windward Hall with greater scrutiny, using techniques he had learned during his military service in tracking hidden enemy positions, he noticed that the soil in a particular section of the estate's extensive gardens showed signs of having been recently disturbed. The area was located near the mansion's conservatory, close to where Evangeline had reportedly been seen speaking with Theodore Pemberton earlier in the evening. But it was also positioned where it could be observed from several windows of the mansion, suggesting that whoever had disturbed the soil had been either extremely bold or confident that they would not be interrupted. Using specialized excavation techniques that were just beginning to be employed in criminal investigations, Harrington and his team carefully excavated the site. What they found was not Evangeline's body, but something equally significant and far more dangerous to the perpetrators. A waterproof metal container buried approximately 4 feet underground, wrapped in oiled canvas and sealed with wax to prevent moisture damage. Inside were copies of the documents that had disappeared from Evangeline's safe, along with additional materials that painted an even more damning picture of corruption among Newport's elite families and revealed the international scope of their criminal activities. The buried archive contained detailed financial records showing systematic embezzlement from the Baltimore and Newport Railroad's worker pension fund, forged safety inspection certificates for at least 12 major construction projects across the Northeast, evidence of bribery involving federal officials, judges, and local politicians, and most shocking of all, detailed correspondence with European criminal organizations that specialized in what the documents euphemistically termed industrial problem resolution. According to Evangeline's documentation, What she had labeled the Newport Compact was not merely a business conspiracy, but an American branch of an international network of wealthy families who had been coordinating their activities across national borders since the 1870s. The compact included the Cunninghams, the Pembertons, and 5 other American families, but it also maintained formal relationships with similar organizations in England, Germany, France, and even Russia. These international connections allowed them to launder money, hide assets, eliminate inconvenient individuals in multiple countries, and manipulate commodity markets on a global scale. The most detailed document in the archive was a comprehensive organizational chart that revealed the full structure of the Newport Compact's operations. At the top level were the 7 American families, each controlling specific industrial sectors: railroads, steel production, coal mining, shipping, banking, textiles, and agricultural commodities. Below them were dozens of subsidiary organizations, private detective agencies, legal firms, medical practices, newspaper companies, and what appeared to be several funeral establishments that specialized in discreet body disposal. One particularly disturbing section of the archive documented what Evangeline had termed the American Death List, a comprehensive record of individuals who had been eliminated by the Newport Compact since its formation in 1877. The list included federal investigators, journalists, labor organizers, business competitors, and even family members who had threatened to expose the organization's activities. Each entry included the person's name, occupation, the specific threat they posed, the method used to eliminate them, and the cost of the operation. The death list revealed that the Newport Compact had been responsible for at least 43 murders over 16 years, using methods that range from poisoning and staged accidents to what appeared to be hired assassinations disguised as random crimes. The victims included not only American citizens, but also several Europeans who had been investigating American business practices at the request of their governments. Among the most shocking entries was the death of Congressman William Hayes of Ohio, who had been leading a congressional investigation into railroad safety violations. Hayes had died in 1891 of what was officially ruled a heart attack, but the archive revealed that he had been poisoned with a substance that mimicked cardiac failure, administered during a dinner at the Union Club in Washington that had been attended by several Newport Compact members. Another entry documented the elimination of Sarah Mitchell, a journalist for the Chicago Tribune, who had been investigating connections between industrial accidents and political corruption. Mitchell had died in a hotel fire that destroyed not only her life, but also her investigation files. The archive revealed that the fire had been deliberately set using a new type of accelerant that burned so quickly and completely that it left no trace of arson, and that Mitchell had been drugged before the fire was set to ensure she could not escape. Perhaps the most chilling discovery in the archive was a document that appeared to be Evangeline's own death warrant, written in the hand of Judge Cornelius Weatherby and countersigned by Theodore Pemberton and Harrison Cunningham himself. The document, dated 3 days before the Summer's End Ball, read, "The EC situation has become untenable. Foreign complications require immediate resolution. Recommend permanent solution with careful attention to documentary cleanup. Suggest maritime disposal to prevent forensic complications. Authorization granted for expenditure up to $75,000 for comprehensive resolution." Attached to this document was a detailed plan for Evangeline's murder, including the method to be used, a drug that would cause apparent heart failure, the location where her body would be disposed of, weighted and dropped into deep ocean water from a private yacht, and the cover story that would be provided to authorities and the press. She had fled with a secret lover to Europe, but had subsequently died in a tragic accident abroad. The plan also included provisions for eliminating any witnesses who might complicate the cover story, with Margaret Flynn and Patrick O'Brien specifically identified as individuals who would need to be managed to prevent them from providing inconvenient testimony. The document noted that Flynn could be discredited by spreading rumors about her mental stability and alcohol consumption, while O'Brien could be transferred to a different position or, if necessary, eliminated in a manner that would appear to be a workplace accident. Captain Harrington's discovery of this archive created an immediate crisis for his investigation. On one hand, he now possessed comprehensive evidence of a criminal conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of American business and government. On the other hand, he realized that his own life was now in danger, as the archive made clear that the Newport Compact had extensive resources for eliminating threats and had already demonstrated their willingness to kill federal investigators. Harrington's concerns proved to be well-founded. Within days of his discovery of the archive, he began to experience pressure from unexpected sources. His superiors at the Pinkerton Agency suggested that he was pursuing unproductive lines of inquiry and recommended focusing on the theory that Evangeline had simply fled with a secret lover. When Harrington refused to abandon his investigation, pointing out that the evidence clearly indicated a murder conspiracy, he was informed that the Cunningham family had complained about his harassment of their associates and had requested that he be removed from the case. More ominously, Harrington began to receive subtle but unmistakable threats. His hotel room was searched while he was conducting interviews, with no items stolen, but his investigation notes clearly examined. He received anonymous letters suggesting that his wife and children in Chicago might be safer if he concluded his investigation quickly and returned home. Most disturbing of all, he discovered that someone had been making inquiries about his personal finances, family background, and potential vulnerabilities that could be exploited if more direct methods of influence proved necessary. Recognizing that his position had become untenable, Harrington made a decision that probably saved his life, but also ensured that the truth about Evangeline's disappearance would remain hidden for decades. He secretly made multiple copies of the most important documents from the archive, hiding them in various locations and arranging for them to be delivered to trusted associates if anything happened to him. He then officially concluded his investigation with a report that largely supported the theory that Evangeline had fled voluntarily, while privately continuing to investigate the case through unofficial channels. As Captain Harrington delved deeper into the Newport Compact through his unofficial investigation, he began to understand that Evangeline's disappearance was not an isolated incident, but rather the culmination of a systematic campaign to eliminate the most serious threat the organization had ever faced. What made Evangeline particularly dangerous was not just her access to inside information about her family's business operations, but her sophisticated understanding of how to gather evidence, preserve it securely, and coordinate with multiple investigators and journalists to ensure that revelations could not be suppressed. Harrington's continued investigation revealed that Evangeline had been working for at least 18 months with a network of individuals who shared her commitment to exposing the Newport Compact's activities. This network included federal investigators who were secretly documenting corruption in various government agencies, foreign journalists who were investigating American business practices from outside the reach of domestic intimidation, and even several wealthy individuals who had broken with their own families' participation in the conspiracy. The most significant member of this network was Dr. Helena Ashford, a physician and social reformer who had been investigating the connection between industrial accidents and inadequate medical care for workers. Dr. Ashford had initially become involved when she noticed that workers injured in railroad accidents were often treated by specific doctors who seemed more concerned with minimizing legal liability than providing appropriate medical care. Her investigation had revealed that several medical practitioners were being paid substantial fees to provide false diagnoses that would prevent injured workers from successfully suing railroad companies. Dr. Ashford had also discovered that certain hospitals were routinely disposing of workers' bodies without proper examination when they died from industrial injuries, often claiming that the families had requested immediate burial for religious reasons. In reality, these bodies were being destroyed to prevent independent medical examiners from discovering evidence of criminal negligence or deliberate poisoning. Dr. Ashford's investigation had documented at least 37 cases where workers had been buried without proper medical examination, despite clear evidence that their deaths were suspicious. When Dr. Ashford had attempted to present her findings to medical authorities and government officials, she had encountered the same pattern of obstruction and intimidation that other investigators had experienced. Medical boards claimed that her evidence was insufficient. Government officials insisted that existing regulations were adequate, and several hospitals where she had attempted to conduct examinations suddenly declared that their records had been destroyed in routine housekeeping procedures. More seriously, Dr. Ashford had begun to receive threats that became increasingly specific and personal. Anonymous letters warned her that lady doctors who interfere in matters beyond their understanding might find their medical licenses revoked, their reputations destroyed, or their personal safety compromised. When these threats failed to deter her investigation, she discovered that rumors were being spread about her professional competence and personal morality, clearly designed to discredit her work and isolate her from potential allies. Dr. Ashford's connection to Evangeline had begun when the young heiress approached her with questions about detecting poisons in human remains. Evangeline had presented herself as a wealthy dilettante with an interest in forensic medicine, but Dr. Ashford quickly realized that her visitor possessed sophisticated knowledge about criminal investigation techniques and was seeking information for specific practical purposes. Over several months, the two women had developed a collaborative relationship, with Dr. Ashford providing medical expertise while Evangeline contributed financial resources and access to business information. Their partnership had proven remarkably effective, allowing them to document the full scope of the Newport Compact's activities with a level of detail and scientific rigor that individual investigators could never have achieved. Dr. Ashford's medical knowledge enabled her to identify patterns of suspicious deaths that might otherwise have been missed, while Evangeline's business connections allowed her to trace financial relationships and document the flow of bribe money through various corporate entities. However, their collaboration had also made both women extremely dangerous to the Newport Compact, which had responded with increasingly sophisticated efforts to neutralize their investigation. Dr. Ashford discovered that medical colleagues were being pressured to avoid associating with her, patients were being warned that she was mentally unstable, and hospitals were being told that employing her might result in the loss of funding from wealthy philanthropists. More ominously, Dr. Ashford began to experience incidents that suggested her personal safety was under threat. Her home was burglarized twice, with no valuables stolen, but her medical records and investigation files carefully examined. She received anonymous letters containing detailed information about her daily routines, clearly indicating that she was under surveillance. Most disturbing of all, she discovered that someone had attempted to tamper with her medical supplies, substituting dangerous substances for legitimate medications in a manner that could have resulted in the accidental poisoning of her patients. As the pressure on both women intensified, they had developed increasingly sophisticated methods of protecting their investigation and ensuring that their evidence would survive even if they were eliminated. Evangeline had established the network of safety deposit boxes and foreign contacts that Captain Harrington had discovered, while Dr. Ashford had created her own system of hidden archives and automatic disclosure procedures. However, their most important innovation was the development of what they termed the insurance policy, a comprehensive document that not only detailed the Newport Compact's criminal activities, but also provided evidence of the organization's efforts to suppress investigation and eliminate witnesses. This document was designed to be so damaging and comprehensive that its release would inevitably result in federal investigations, international diplomatic consequences, and criminal prosecutions that could not be suppressed through bribery or intimidation. The insurance policy contained not only documentation of past crimes, but also evidence of ongoing criminal activities and detailed predictions about future crimes that the Newport Compact was planning. This predictive element was crucial because it meant that if Evangeline and Dr. Ashford were eliminated, The subsequent fulfillment of their predictions would provide compelling evidence that their other allegations were accurate. On the evening of the summer's end ball, Evangeline had carried a copy of the insurance policy in the leather case that James Weatherby had observed her carrying down the mansion's staircase. Her plan was to present this document to the assembled members of the Newport Compact, demanding that they confess their crimes and make restitution to their victims. If they refused, she would activate the automatic disclosure procedures that would simultaneously release the document to multiple newspapers, federal prosecutors, and foreign governments. What Evangeline had not anticipated was that the Newport Compact had developed their own intelligence network that had been monitoring her activities and had discovered at least some of her preparations. While they did not know the full extent of her evidence or the details of her disclosure procedures, they had learned enough to realize that she represented an existential threat to their organization. This intelligence had led to the decision, documented in Judge Weatherby's authorization, to eliminate her permanently rather than attempting further negotiation or intimidation. The confrontation that took place in Evangeline's chambers on the night of August 14th was not a spontaneous event, but rather a carefully planned operation that involved not only Theodore Pemberton and Judge Weatherby, but also several other members of the Newport Compact who had positioned themselves strategically throughout the mansion to ensure that the operation could be completed without interference. However, before this confrontation took place, Harrington's investigation revealed that Evangeline had managed to complete one final act of defiance that would ultimately ensure her posthumous victory over the Newport Compact. At some point during the evening, she had succeeded in activating at least some of her disclosure procedures, sending coded telegrams to her network of allies and setting in motion the chain of events that would eventually expose the organization's crimes to public scrutiny. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Newport intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in this tale of Gilded Age corruption and murder. The truth about Evangeline Cunningham's final hours began to emerge through an extraordinary convergence of evidence that Captain Harrington would not fully piece together until months after the official investigation had been closed. The breakthrough came when Margaret Flynn, Evangeline's personal maid, finally found the courage to provide a complete account of what she had witnessed on the night of August 14, 1893. Flynn's testimony, corroborated by physical evidence and documentary materials that Evangeline had managed to preserve, revealed a confrontation of stunning brutality that demonstrated the lengths to which America's wealthiest families were prepared to go to protect their criminal empire. According to Flynn's detailed account, the confrontation in Evangeline's chambers had indeed taken place, but not as a spontaneous argument that escalated beyond control. Instead, it was a carefully orchestrated operation that involved extensive preparation and the participation of individuals who had clearly planned and rehearsed their roles. Flynn reported that she had observed unusual activity in the mansion throughout the evening, with several guests making multiple trips to what appeared to be a temporary command center that had been established in Harrison Cunningham's private study. At approximately 11:15 p.m., not 11:30 as she had initially reported, Flynn had heard voices in Evangeline's chambers. However, rather than simply listening through the keyhole, she had utilized a network of servant passages that allowed her to observe the confrontation from a concealed position that provided her with a clear view of most of the room. What she witnessed was not a heated argument, but rather a methodical interrogation designed to extract information about Evangeline's evidence and disclosure procedures. The participants in this interrogation included not only Theodore Pemberton, Judge Weatherby, and Harrison Cunningham, but also Dr. Edmund Sheffield, the state medical examiner, and two other men whom Flynn did not recognize, but who appeared to be professional criminals rather than members of Newport society. These men were clearly there to provide specialized expertise in what Flynn euphemistically described as physical persuasion techniques. The interrogation began with Judge Weatherby presenting Evangeline with what he claimed was a legal document that would require her to surrender all evidence in her possession and submit to psychiatric evaluation for delusions and paranoid fantasies. When Evangeline refused to sign this document, Dr. Sheffield produced a medical bag containing what he described as therapeutic treatments that will help clarify your thinking about these unfortunate misunderstandings. Evangeline's response demonstrated both her courage and her sophisticated understanding of the legal and medical systems that were being used against her. She informed her captors that she had consulted with legal experts about such coercive tactics and understood that any confessions or surrenders of evidence obtained through force or medical coercion would be inadmissible in court. More importantly, she revealed that she had anticipated exactly this type of confrontation and had already activated legal and journalistic procedures that would ensure the truth would emerge regardless of what happened to her. At this point, according to Flynn's testimony, the tone of the confrontation changed dramatically. Judge Weatherby abandoned any pretense of legal procedure and began to describe in graphic detail what would happen to Evangeline if she did not cooperate voluntarily. He explained that the Newport Compact had developed sophisticated methods for eliminating inconvenient individuals that left no trace of foul play, and that they had successfully used these methods to eliminate dozens of people who had threatened their interests. Theodore Pemberton supplemented the judge's threats with detailed descriptions of what had happened to specific individuals who had previously attempted to expose the Newport Compact's activities. He described the death of Congressman Hayes in Washington, the elimination of journalist Sarah Mitchell in Chicago, and several other cases that Flynn recognized from newspaper accounts she had read. Pemberton's knowledge of these cases was so detailed and intimate that it was clear he had been personally involved in planning and executing these murders. However, Evangeline's response to these revelations surprised her interrogators and demonstrated that she had understood far more about their organization than they had realized. She informed them that she had spent months documenting their involvement in these specific cases and had already provided detailed evidence about each murder to her network of investigators and journalists. She also revealed that she possessed evidence of their international connections, including correspondence with European criminal organizations and documentation of murders that had been committed in foreign countries. Most significantly, Evangeline revealed that she had evidence of the Newport Compact's involvement in what she termed the Philadelphia incident, a train derailment that had killed over 40 passengers and had been officially attributed to mechanical failure. According to her evidence, the derailment had been deliberately caused to eliminate a group of European investors who had been investigating irregularities in American railroad financing. The investors had been traveling together on a specific train, making them an ideal target for what appeared to be a tragic accident. The revelation about the Philadelphia incident created what Flynn described as a moment of absolute silence in the room, as the interrogators realized that Evangeline possessed evidence of their most carefully concealed crime. This incident had involved not only multiple murders, but also the destruction of evidence that belonged to foreign governments, creating the potential for international diplomatic crises and criminal prosecutions that could not be controlled through domestic corruption. At this point, Dr. Sheffield produced a syringe containing what he described as a preparation that will provide immediate relief from these unfortunate delusions. However, Evangeline had anticipated this possibility as well and had prepared for it by consuming a substance that would counteract most common poisons and drugs. She had also positioned various items in her room that she could use as weapons if physical force became necessary. The final phase of the confrontation began when Evangeline attempted to reach the window that led to her emergency escape route. She had prepared this route months earlier, installing a rope ladder that would allow her to descend to a boat that she had hidden among the rocks below the mansion. However, the two professional criminals had anticipated this possibility and had positioned themselves to prevent her escape. According to Flynn's testimony, what followed was a brief but violent struggle, during which Evangeline managed to fight off her attackers long enough to throw the leather case containing her most important evidence out the window, hoping that it would either be carried out to sea or recovered by allies who were monitoring the situation from boats positioned offshore. However, she was ultimately overwhelmed by superior numbers and was injected with Dr. Sheffield's therapeutic preparation. The drug did not kill Evangeline immediately, but rather induced a state of paralysis that left her conscious but unable to move or speak. In this condition, she was forced to listen as her captors discussed the specific methods they would use to dispose of her body and eliminate any evidence of their involvement in her disappearance. Judge Weatherby explained that they would wait until the drug had fully taken effect, then transport her body to a boat that was waiting in a secluded cove several miles from the mansion. The boat would carry her body far out to sea, where it would be weighted and dropped into deep water that would prevent recovery even if the location were somehow discovered. Her personal effects would be distributed in various locations to create the impression that she had fled voluntarily, while forged documents would be created to support the cover story that she had died in a tragic accident in Europe after eloping with a secret lover. However, even as she lay paralyzed and helpless, Evangeline managed to achieve one final victory over her murderers. Flynn observed that she was wearing a special ring that contained a hidden compartment and that she somehow managed to activate a mechanism that released a small amount of chemical powder into the air. This powder had been designed to react with specific substances to create a distinctive odor that would be detectable for several days, even after attempts to clean the room. More importantly, Flynn realized that the powder had been formulated to adhere to clothing and skin, meaning that anyone who was present during its release would carry traces of the chemical for weeks afterward. This would provide evidence that could potentially identify Evangeline's murderers if investigators were sophisticated enough to detect and analyze the chemical traces. Flynn's final observation was perhaps the most significant for understanding the full scope of the Newport Compact's criminal enterprise. As the effects of the drug began to overwhelm Evangeline, Judge Weatherby made a telephone call using the private line in her room. Flynn could hear only one side of the conversation, but it was clear that the judge was reporting the success of the operation to someone who was not present in the mansion. The conversation included references to the Chicago situation and the London complications, suggesting that the Newport Compact was simultaneously conducting similar operations in multiple locations. Flynn heard the judge say, "The primary asset has been secured, and the documentation issue has been contained. Recommend proceeding with Phase 2 of the containment protocol. The international complications should be resolved within 72 hours. This conversation confirmed that Evangeline's murder was part of a larger operation designed to eliminate multiple threats to the Newport Compact's activities simultaneously. The organization had apparently identified several individuals in different locations who possessed dangerous evidence and had coordinated their elimination to prevent any surviving witnesses from piecing together the full scope of their crimes. The ultimate resolution of the Evangeline Cunningham case revealed both the extraordinary sophistication of the Newport Compact's criminal operations and the remarkable effectiveness of the countermeasures that Evangeline had developed to ensure that her evidence would survive her murder. While her killers succeeded in eliminating her physically, they failed to prevent the disclosure of her evidence, resulting in consequences that ultimately destroyed their organization, even as it allowed most of the individual participants to escape legal punishment. The first breakthrough in exposing the Newport Compact came exactly 10 days after Evangeline's disappearance, when journalists at the New York World, the Boston Herald, and the Philadelphia Inquirer simultaneously received packages containing comprehensive documentation of the organization's criminal activities. These packages had been mailed from multiple post offices across New England using a system that Evangeline had developed to ensure that even if some deliveries were intercepted, enough evidence would reach its intended recipients to guarantee exposure. The packages contained not only copies of the Newport Compact's internal documents, but also detailed analyses that Evangeline had prepared with the help of Dr. Ashford and other collaborators. These analyses demonstrated connections between apparently unrelated deaths, explained the methods used to corrupt government officials and medical examiners, and provided a comprehensive organizational chart that revealed the full scope of the conspiracy. Most significantly, the packages included predictions about specific actions that the Newport Compact would take in response to Evangeline's disappearance. These predictions proved remarkably accurate, as the organization's efforts to suppress investigation and eliminate witnesses followed patterns that Evangeline had anticipated based on her study of their previous operations. When these predictions were fulfilled with precise accuracy, they provided compelling evidence that Evangeline's other allegations were equally reliable. The newspaper investigations that followed generated enormous public outrage and political pressure that even the Newport Compact's extensive corruption network could not completely suppress. Federal prosecutors were forced to open investigations, congressional committees demanded hearings, and international diplomatic pressure began to mount as European governments realized that their citizens had been murdered by American business interests. However, the legal consequences for individual members of the Newport Compact were surprisingly limited, demonstrating the extent to which wealth and political influence could shield criminals from prosecution even when their crimes were extensively documented and publicly revealed. Harrison Cunningham died of what was officially reported as a heart attack just 2 weeks after the first newspaper stories appeared, though the rapid onset of his symptoms and the circumstances of his death were consistent with poisoning. His death eliminated the prosecutor's most important potential witness and made it difficult to pursue charges against other organization members. Theodore Pemberton fled to Argentina just days before federal marshals arrived to arrest him, using financial resources and transportation networks that the Newport Compact had established for exactly such emergencies. He lived under an assumed name on a remote estate until his death in 1923, never returning to the United States but continuing to coordinate with other organization members through encrypted correspondence and financial transfers. Judge Weatherby was quietly removed from the bench and retired to a private estate in California, officially due to health concerns, but actually as part of a negotiated agreement that allowed him to avoid prosecution in exchange for providing limited information about the organization's judicial corruption activities. However, the information he provided was carefully selected to protect the most important participants while sacrificing lower-level associates who had become liabilities. Dr. Sheffield, the medical examiner, committed suicide rather than face prosecution, but not before destroying extensive records that would have provided evidence of his involvement in covering up numerous murders. His death was itself suspicious, as he was found in his office with a gunshot wound that could have been either self-inflicted or administered by someone seeking to prevent him from revealing information about other organization members. Of the 7 families identified as Newport Compact members, only 2 faced serious legal consequences, and even these were limited to financial penalties and social ostracism rather than criminal prosecution. 3 family patriarchs died under suspicious circumstances within months of the revelations, apparently victims of the same elimination methods they had used against their own enemies. The remaining families used their wealth and political connections to avoid prosecution, though their reputations were permanently damaged and their business operations were severely disrupted. The most tragic aspect of the case was the systematic elimination of witnesses and potential informants that followed the public revelations. Margaret Flynn, whose testimony had been crucial to understanding Evangeline's fate, disappeared shortly after giving her statement to investigators. She was reportedly seen boarding a train to Chicago, carrying a suitcase and what appeared to be a substantial amount of cash, but no further trace of her was ever found, despite extensive searches by both law enforcement and private investigators. Patrick O'Brien, the night watchman whose observations had corroborated Flynn's testimony, died in what was ruled an accidental drowning 3 months after the investigation concluded. However, the circumstances of his death, he was found in a mill pond despite being an experienced swimmer who had no reason to be in that location, suggested that he had been murdered to prevent him from providing additional testimony. Dr. Helena Ashford, who had been Evangeline's primary collaborator in documenting the Newport Compact's activities, survived longer than most witnesses, but was ultimately eliminated in a manner that demonstrated the organization's sophisticated methods. She died in what appeared to be a laboratory accident, apparently overcome by chemical fumes while conducting research. However, investigation of the accident revealed that her laboratory's ventilation system had been deliberately sabotaged in a manner that required extensive technical knowledge and careful planning. The elimination of witnesses continued for several years after the initial revelations, creating a pattern of deaths that was clearly deliberate, but sufficiently spread out over time and geography to avoid attracting attention from law enforcement agencies that were not specifically looking for connections. In total, at least 15 individuals who had provided evidence or assistance related to the Evangeline Cunningham investigation died under suspicious circumstances between 1893 and 1897. However, the most significant long-term consequence of the case was the gradual transformation of investigative journalism and federal law enforcement that resulted from the techniques that Evangeline had pioneered. Her methods of gathering evidence, preserving it securely, and coordinating with multiple investigators and journalists became standard practices for reporters investigating powerful interests. Several prominent journalists of the early 20th century cited the Newport Compact exposé as their inspiration for entering the field and credited Evangeline's techniques with making their own investigations possible. The federal government also began to develop more sophisticated methods for investigating corporate crimes and political corruption, partly in response to the evidence that the Newport Compact had been able to operate for over 15 years without detection, despite committing dozens of murders and stealing millions of dollars. New agencies were created with specialized expertise in financial crimes, interstate criminal conspiracies, and the corruption of government officials. Perhaps most importantly, the international diplomatic consequences of the case led to the development of new treaties and agreements designed to prevent American businesses from committing crimes against foreign citizens with impunity. Several countries established special investigative units to monitor American business activities within their borders, and international cooperation in criminal investigations was significantly enhanced. The Cunningham fortune was eventually inherited by distant relatives who had no connection to the railroad business and no knowledge of the Newport Compact's activities. These relatives sold most of the family's business interests and used the proceeds to establish charitable foundations focused on worker safety and industrial accident prevention. A fitting memorial to the 17 workers who had died in the Baltimore Bridge collapse and the dozens of other victims of corporate negligence. Windward Hall, the mansion where Evangeline had been murdered, was sold and converted into a luxury hotel, though the business struggled due to persistent reports of unexplained phenomena in the rooms that had once been Evangeline's private chambers. Guests reported hearing voices in the walls, finding documents that would disappear when examined closely, and experiencing dreams that seemed to contain detailed information about historical events they had no way of knowing. The mansion was eventually demolished in 1932 after a suspicious fire that destroyed most of the building, including the room where Evangeline had died. The leather case that Evangeline had thrown from her window during her final struggle was never officially recovered, despite extensive searches of the coastline and ocean floor. However, there are persistent rumors that it was actually found by local fishermen who recognized its importance and secretly turned it over to federal investigators. According to these rumors, the case contained evidence of even more extensive corruption, possibly involving federal politicians, Supreme Court justices, and international business conspiracies that extended far beyond the Newport Compact's American operations. Some historians believe that this additional evidence was suppressed by federal authorities, who concluded that its revelation would cause such extensive political and economic disruption that it would threaten the stability of the American government itself. According to this theory, certain government officials made a calculated decision to prosecute lower-level participants in the Newport Compact while protecting higher-level figures whose exposure would have created unmanageable political crises. The most persistent mystery surrounding the case concerns the ultimate fate of what Evangeline had termed the insurance policy, the comprehensive document that detailed not only past crimes, but also predicted future activities of the Newport Compact. While portions of this document were clearly included in the materials that reached newspapers and prosecutors, there are indications that additional sections existed that were never publicly revealed. Contemporary observers noted that several specific predictions included in the revealed portions of the insurance policy were fulfilled with remarkable precision in the years following Evangeline's death. But other predictions that were referenced in private correspondence were never publicly disclosed. This suggests that some portions of the document may have been suppressed by authorities who recognized that their revelation would have consequences extending far beyond the prosecution of the Newport Compact members. In the end, Evangeline Cunningham's story serves as both an inspiration and a warning about the possibilities and limitations of individual courage in confronting systematic corruption. Her sophisticated understanding of criminal investigation techniques, her ability to build networks of allies and collaborators, and her careful preparation of evidence preservation and disclosure procedures enabled her to achieve a posthumous victory over her murderers that would have been impossible for less prepared and resourceful individual. However, her story also demonstrates the brutal effectiveness of organized wealth and power in protecting itself through violence and intimidation. Even though her evidence ultimately exposed the Newport Compact's activities and led to the destruction of their organization, most of the individual participants escaped serious punishment and continued to live comfortable lives supported by wealth that had been accumulated through murder and theft. Perhaps the most important lesson of the Evangeline Cunningham case is that the struggle between justice and corruption is not a single battle that can be won or lost definitively, but rather an ongoing conflict that requires constant vigilance and courage from individuals who are willing to risk their personal safety for the greater good. Evangeline's sacrifice contributed to improvements in worker safety, government accountability, and journalistic independence that benefited millions of people. But the fundamental systems that enabled the Newport Compact to operate, the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a small elite, remained largely unchanged. This mystery shows us that even in the face of overwhelming corruption and violence, individual conscience and courage can make a difference. The truth has a way of surviving, even when powerful forces attempt to bury it beneath layers of money, influence, and intimidation. Evangeline Cunningham's evidence survived her murder and ultimately achieved the justice she had sought, though at a cost that demonstrates the true price of challenging entrenched power. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or might there be more secrets still hidden in the archives of America's wealthiest families? The techniques that Evangeline developed for investigating corporate crimes are still used by journalists and law enforcement agencies today, suggesting that her legacy continues to threaten those who would use wealth and power to exploit and harm others. Leave your comment below about what you think really happened to that missing leather case and whether similar conspiracies might still be operating today. If you enjoyed this tale and want more historical mysteries like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves dark stories from America's past. See you in the next video.